Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the All-Inclusive podcast with Jay Ruderman.
Hi, I'm Jay Ruderman. All-Inclusive is a podcast focused on inclusion and social justice. Join me as I interview leaders and experts on the latest news focused on advocacy for social justice. In order to make progress that will lead to a more equitable future, honest discussions must be held. That is what All-Inclusive is all about. Listen and subscribe to the All-Inclusive podcast on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, and anywhere else podcasts are available. Visit the show website for more information and full episode transcripts at www.allinclusivepodcast.com.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 279, Voice for Justice. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we are back to our subject of Jews and the trans experience after a one-week break where we talked to Rachel Gross about her wonderful new book, Beyond the Synagogue. And today we have a fantastic guest, Ari Lev Fornari. But before we jump into that conversation, just another brief pause to make a plea at the end of our fiscal year for your financial support. Judaism Unbound is a nonprofit organization, and oh boy, is it a nonprofit organization. Nobody here is making any profit whatsoever, but we do need to keep the lights on. We do need to keep paying for our website, for the tools that we use to record the podcast, and we also need to make at least a little bit of money so that our families allow us to continue doing this work. So if you are someone who has enjoyed this podcast, especially someone who's enjoyed this podcast for a long time, I want to invite you to pause the audio for just a moment and go to our website, www.judaismunbound.com/donate, and make a small donation. And by small, I really mean small. We ask you to consider $1 per episode or hour that you spend with us here on Judaism Unbound or on Jewish Live. But if you can't afford that, really any gift at all is meaningful on so many levels. Even if you can just contribute $1 for the whole year or $5 for the whole year. It's meaningful because it gives us some feedback that our work is appreciated by you and that you at least want to support this work continuing as much as you possibly can. It's also meaningful because it's a signal to other funders that our listeners want to support this work. And so what we're really trying to do in the 2 weeks between now and the end of June is not so much raise a lot of money, well, that would be nice, but to have a lot of donors, because it's really important as a signaling device to say that this is a huge community of people who want to support this work. We've had over 100,000 people interact with our work over the past year. But so far, less than 1% of that 100,000 have made a donation this year. We're trying to get that up to 1%. So would you be part of the 1%, not the 1% of the wealthiest Americans, the 1% of the most enthusiastic Judaism Unbound listeners who wants to make a small donation? And if you would, please go to www.judaismunbound.com/donate and make your small donation. Whatever it is, we are so grateful for it. And now that you paused the audio and you're back, we want to welcome you back to this episode of Judaism Unbound, and we want to welcome our fantastic guest today. Our guest today is Ari Lev Fornari. Ari Lev Fornari is a white, queer, trans person of Ashkenazi and Italian descent who is currently the senior rabbi at Kol Tzedek, a relatively young synagogue in West Philadelphia. It's a Reconstructionist, social justice-focused synagogue in West Philadelphia that was founded in 2004. It describes its members as artists, organizers, academics, parents, professionals, students, social workers, midwives, and misfits. Ari Lev Fornari has rabbinical ordination from the Rabbinical School of Hebrew College. He has worked as a Jewish educator, Hebrew school director, and prison chaplain. In a previous iteration, Ari Lev Fornari was the executive director of Svara and currently serves on the faculty of Svara and is now bringing Svara's approach to West Philadelphia. Ari Lev Fornari also trained at Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, CBST, in New York, so he has a lot of connections to previous guests on Judaism Unbound, and we are extremely thrilled to welcome him today to Judaism Unbound. So Ari Lev Fornari, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
It's so good to be here. What an honor and a joy.
I was a member of a synagogue, and the rabbi was a woman, and they were hiring a new rabbi. And one of the people that they interviewed was a man. And our friend's child turned to her and said, "Mommy, I didn't know that a man could be a rabbi." And it actually happens to also have been an LGBT-founded synagogue, but that wasn't really the point of that story. But what's interesting is just that this little child was growing up with an understanding of what a rabbi is that is so profoundly different from the way that we grew up or the way that our parents grew up. And I'm thinking about that in terms of the fact that we're doing this series on trans Jews and et cetera. And here you are, a trans rabbi. And so I'm wondering if you could just reflect a little bit about that and about how you see where the world has changed, where it hasn't, where it's going in light of that.
Thanks, Dan. It's a really great question. I almost got teary listening to it. It evokes a lot of emotion for me personally. Before we really jump in, I just want to share as a point of access for those listening that, as Dan said, my name is Rabbi Ari Lev. I use he and they pronouns, and I'm a person with white skin and warm olive undertones, dark curly hair, and I'm sitting in my own home wearing a cap and a plaid shirt, so you can have a visual sense of where I'm coming from. And there's a T-shirt that some of the Jews of color wear at Cold Tzedek, and they got it from from an organization called Jews in All Hues that's run by Jared Jackson. And it says, "This is what a Jew looks like." And in some ways, I feel this is a kind of spiritual armor that Black and Indigenous and people of color wear when they go to synagogue to sort of say, I belong here. And we're remaking the image of who a Jew is, especially in the ways that Judaism has sort of colluded and been co-opted by white supremacy culture. And there's also a T-shirt that a friend of mine used to wear in rabbinical school she was a woman and she wore a T-shirt, "This is what a rabbi looks like." And I feel we're also living through a moment where we're remaking not just who a Jew is, but who Jewish authority is, right? Which is in some ways, who are the teachers and transmitters of Jewish tradition? One of my important roots is that I grew up in a classical Reform synagogue on Long Island, and Rabbi Karen Bender was a recent graduate of the Hebrew Union College. And my synagogue, Temple Bethel of Great Neck, hired her, and she was among the first generation of lesbian rabbis. And she was really the first out queer person I knew as a young person. So I can't underestimate the impact she had in my own personal imagination about who I am and who I could become. So for me, Judaism has always been a site of queer positivity, which I think is unique and unexpected and not entirely intentional, though I know Rabbi Jerry Davidson, who was my childhood rabbi, who was the senior rabbi, he understood that this was a moment of transformation for the Jewish community in hiring her. I've wanted to be a rabbi since I was a little kid. I went on a long path from sort of the idea of wanting to be a rabbi to actually becoming a rabbi. And then I would even put like a next chapter to actually being the rabbi of a congregation. So I wanted to be a rabbi for a long time, but I really had to go through a spiritual journey, first of coming out as queer and then of coming out as trans. I think it's fair to say that most of the people that I went to rabbinical school with potentially had never met a trans person. I had been living in San Francisco and really in sort of, I would say almost like incubating in a queer and trans Jewish community. And when I went to rabbinical school in 2008, it felt like I was emerging and kind of coming out into the wider Jewish world. And I really felt some combination of uncomfortable in that environment and uncomfortable in my own skin. This was before the time where there were gender neutral bathrooms in the building. It wasn't normative or even necessarily permissive practice to share your preferred pronouns. So if we're looking at the last 15 years, it's been an unbelievably transformative time for trans liberation explicitly and specifically within a Jewish context.
I just want to ask you actually real quick, because you mentioned that you wanted to be a rabbi since you were 10 or 11. And I'm curious, was there a moment in your life when you started to understand that you were queer and that you were trans where you said, well, I guess I can't be a rabbi?
That's a good question, Dan. If this was an episode of Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, I think we would want that to be true. But that really wasn't sort of my experience. I didn't have the sense that being queer and trans was at odds with being a rabbi or even being Jewish. And I credit so many people before me who made that possible. But I did have a sense that they weren't integrated parts of my identity. That's what feels important to say, is they weren't integrated parts of my identity. And I had this sense that I was queer and trans and kind of living that life over here, and this sense that I was Jewish or maybe very Jewish or wanting to be a rabbi. And I didn't have a sense of how to bridge them. And one of the things that was important to me was part of being queer and trans was being sort of iconoclastic, this kind of boundary crossing, rebellious, everything is possible, kind of bursting norm sensibility. And I found that very liberating and very energizing. I also found it a bit unmooring. In some ways, the deeper I got into my own queer and transformation and identity self-realization, I wanted something very old that I could rely upon. And Judaism has become that thing. Judaism has become sort of something rooted in ancient wisdom that is tried and true and kind of weathered, to which I can use also as a sounding board for self-identification. If part of what being queer and trans has done for me is it sharpens sort of my critical thinking skills and my ability for deconstruction, part of what my own experience of Torah study and my own Jewish spiritual practices have done is they've softened me. And I never even considered becoming a congregational rabbi. It didn't seem like an option. Many things seemed possible, and that didn't seem like one of the things that was possible. And that was for many reasons. And I think one of those reasons was the world isn't ready for some mainstream synagogue to have a trans rabbi. So I ended up becoming the director of the Boston Jewish Education Program, for which I'm eternally grateful. And while my primary job was basically to be a school administrator, I found myself entirely wanting to transform it into a Jewish community. So I would offer, come get spiritual care and get a beer with the rabbi at Wednesday at noon at this restaurant. And let's plan a Friday night where we can sing songs and play games in this place. And I found myself doing the work of cultivating connective intergenerational community. And it kind of occurred to me, I think you might want to be a congregational rabbi. And then in that moment, in a kind of way that has always felt a bit like a calling, Rabbi Lauren Grable Herman, who's the founding rabbi of Kol Tzedek, announced that she was leaving Kol Tzedek. And that day, 4 people called me and they were like, I think there's a job for you. There was this sense that Kol Tzedek was uniquely positioned and perhaps we would be a really good fit for each other, which has been true. And I'm very grateful for it.
I'd love to talk a little bit more about Kol Tzedek. I mean, a few things. One, everybody who is a frequent listener of this podcast will know I'm big on names of things, and I'm also big on word plays. Kol Tzedek is a great name. I also recently, I went on a Google deep dive, and I realized the percentage of synagogues that actually define what their name means for folks is incredibly small. Like most don't. And so there's these beautiful names that have deep roots in Bible or in whatever. And like people don't always know what they are, even members of them. So I want to talk about Kol Tzedek, because Kol Tzedek, it means, voice of justice. I mean, I'm curious how you translate it, but Kol being voice, Tzedek being justice or righteousness, which is a pretty dope name for a synagogue, if you ask me, both the voice part and the justice part. I'm also thinking, though, that you could do a little play, because in English, K-O-L could also be a rendering of the Hebrew word kol, which means all. So like all justice. Like all justice. That's what we're here to do at Kol Tzedek. All justice. But I'm curious, why were there 4 people calling you in particular? Like clearly there's something about Kol Tzedek that seemed a match, not just to you, but to all these other folks who saw that potential. What is this community and how have you been leading it this past little bit?
It's funny. We just so Kol Tzedek was founded in 2004. And I've been the rabbi there since 2016. And we just had a program over Zoom a few months ago called The History of Kol Tzedek with 2 founding members, Rhea and Naomi, who are essentially our internal matriarchs. And they had the little ballot for when the community voted on its name. And I finally saw what the other options are, because I've always wondered, what was the runner-up? Perhaps, I think the runner-up in my personal mind, although I don't know what the runner-up was in the actual vote, which they didn't have recorded, was Kihilat HaMa'arav, which is the Western community. And the reason that makes sense is because we're in West Philadelphia. And politically, that's very significant, actually. I also, in the world where historically we were constantly trying to face east, it seems naturally transgressive to name ourselves as the Western-facing community. The question of how you translate Kol Tzedek is itself its own midrash, and I appreciate that you've kind of gone there. I believe on our papers of incorporation, it's voice of justice. But I can tell you that I've made a practice of translating it as voice for justice. And there was a conversation on the board a few years ago while I was the rabbi of Kol Tzedek, which kind of began to get at that question that you asked, which is Kol Tzedek. Are we all justice? Are we primarily actually an organizing body? Are we primarily a social justice organization that also offers Shabbat and holidays and some other stuff? And the board made a very intentional choice a few years ago to say, first and foremost, we're a spiritual community, we're a synagogue, and we're one that's with a real social justice focus and with deep roots and commitments to anti-racism and economic justice. And some of that is about what we do as a congregation, and some of that really is about who we are. It's a community with an abundance of organizers, people in public policy and public health, healers, healthcare providers, teachers, social workers. Kol Tzedek was a founding member of POWER, Philadelphians Organized to Witness, Empower, and Rebuild, which is the multi-faith organizing body that was once citywide and is now statewide. And so I think some of its identity also came from prioritizing its engagement with this Black-led, multiracial, multi-faith organizing body as a primary means of gathering and resource allocation for the community itself. We're hoping to sort of go on a strategic planning over the course of the next year. And that's one of the ways that we're actually engaging with Shemitah, will be to say, doing some of that deep introspection and sort of resting a little bit from the work of programmatic output and turning some of that energy inward to sort of revisit ourselves, which we haven't done in about a decade, and say, who are we and what are our priorities for the coming years? Certainly one of the priorities that we're working with is, what does it mean to be or become or wrestle with the question of abolition? For Shavuot, we planned a teach-in actually on, we called it an abolition teach-in. And we taught some of the Torah of abolition, which I'm in Chavruta learning with Koach Baruch Fraser, who's our rabbinic intern.
And another guest in this series.
Amazing. And also with Rabbi B'nai Lappi, we are in active Chavruta and doing a translation to project together. So some of it will be teaching the Torah of abolition. We'll also be having members of Kol Tzedek leading a teach-in on the Breathe Act, which has been called for by the Movement for Black Lives. And we're doing a book group discussion on Adrienne Marie Brown's newest book, We Will Not Cancel Us. And one of the important things about that is being able to see abolition both as an external and an internal organizing framework and an internal transformation project. So how do we as individuals and we as a community need to transform, and how is our transformation linked to wider organizing transformations?
I'm noting that word transform because this is a unit featuring trans voices, and we use words like transform all the time and don't notice the trans part. But there's a lot of beautiful words in the English language that start with trans. I think about translation a lot, transformation, transmission, a lot of sort of sacred words. Transgression, yes. But the idea that folks who identify as transgender are part of organizations' work that is transformational makes a kind of sense to me. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, being the leader of this synagogue, how is that connection made? What are to what extent does it feel like, okay, I'm one person, I'm trans, and there's other people who are cis, there's other people who are whatever gender identity they are, and we're all doing work together, which is great. And to what extent is it like, you know what, it actually really makes abundant sense that there are particularly trans queer folks that are leaders, including yourself, of this project?
For probably most of human time and across most indigenous communities, trans and two-spirit and non-binary and multigender, people have basically been spiritual leaders and healers within their communities. I think the reason this makes abundant sense and is not coincidence, it's actually one of the reasons why in my time at Kol Tzedek, I've been the trans rabbi, and we've now had 2 rabbinic interns, both of whom have also been trans. And I'm proud to say that none of us has had to teach on the question of being trans, which I really am grateful to the Kol Tzedek community for, that we've been allowed to be ourselves and not made the intimacy of our identities have to be also our Torah, even though we all certainly have a lot of Torah to share about it. But I think the reason it makes sense is, and this is true of queer people also in different ways, is the journey inward has a lot to teach us. The process of coming out as anything, right? I think this is true of people who convert into a religious tradition also, or people who are on other identity-based paths that are transformational, right? That require a kind of journey inward and an actualization outward. That is the source of a lot of spiritual wisdom. So much of what I have to offer as a rabbi, not all of it, but so much of it comes from the pain and the struggle of my own realization of who I am. And I'll give one example. I feel like one of the greatest things that my transition has taught me, coming out as trans and living into my trans identity, has taught me that there is loss in every choice. And I never stop learning that lesson. And that lesson allows me to be with people in all sorts of moments when they're experiencing loss. But it would be misleading to say I just learned that by being a human being. I could have learned it some other way, and all sorts of people learn it in different ways. I personally learned that by being trans because I felt I had to lose a lot to change in the ways that I wanted to change, in the ways that felt true to myself. I let go of a lot of expectation and identification with lots of people in my life and lots of people who, lots of ways that I thought I would be. And the narrative I had learned is that choices that are right for you feel good, right? They feel positive. There is gain to be had. And actually my experience of transitioning is actually been a practice of choosing loss over and over again and feeling that loss as an opening to wholeness. And I could never have anticipated it. And that's how I learned it. So the fact that we're seeing the growth of trans Jewish spiritual leadership makes so much sense to me because my trans colleagues, we've been on a journey and it's painful and growthful and important. And there is a lot of Torah in that journey. And there's a lot to teach from it and a lot to learn from it.
I want to continue to pursue that. And I'm not sure, if this gets us into the realm of trans theology, which I know is something that you want to talk about, or abolition or all of the above. But there's something that as you were talking, it was occurring to me that it connects in a weird way to some of these episodes that we've done about, for example, psychedelics. And the reason why is because I'm thinking about Judaism, and maybe this is true of every religion and every culture, and I just know Judaism, but I feel like one of the things that it's trying to do is say, hey, something really important happened to us a long time ago. We were slaves in Egypt, and then we were freed. And back then, some really wise person took away from that experience that we now have to be against slavery for others. And then the question becomes, how am I going to pass this value along from generation to generation to generation when they grow increasingly distant from the experience, the primary experience of being slaves in Egypt? And that in some way, Judaism is an attempt to do that I feel sometimes or often hasn't worked the way that it was hoped that it would. That even though we have a Seder every year, are we really feeling like we were slaves in Egypt? Is it really working? Is the technology really working? And when we were talking to people about psychedelics, what was interesting to me about that was the possibility that because of psychedelics, people could have that revelation experience as a primary experience and wouldn't have to have it mediated through these various increasingly distant attempts to recapitulate it. And I'm thinking about whether that is also the case for people, not only trans folks, but people who have had some experience in their life that is, utterly transformational in a way like that. And not that every human being hasn't experienced something in their life that is transformational, but maybe those who have experienced it in a bigger way ought to be our leaders because somehow they can connect us with that experience with only 1 degree of separation rather than, 10 degrees of separation. I'm just wondering how that lands on you and where you take that.
I think what you're asking that's most resonant for me is where does insight come from? Where do we learn sustaining truths about ourselves and about the world? And I think the Jewish language for that insight would be some form of revelation. To learn a thing that can't be taken from us, like we know it in our bones. And, for me, that revelation actually profoundly happened through meditation. And so in some ways, perhaps meditation was sort of my own psychedelic journey. Since 2007, I've had a sustained meditation practice through the Vipassana tradition, which is a branch of Theravada Buddhism. The need for that practice was probably always there to manage my own anxiety. But the motivation for it came from experiences that I had in the summer of 2006 in Palestine. I spent a summer in the West Bank and really spent the entire summer running from the gunfire and tear gas of the Israeli Defense Force through, nonviolent Palestinian-led protests. And a summer that didn't look that different from the the streets of the U.S. through the recent uprising in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and Walter Wallace here in West Philadelphia, where state violence is coming from us. And I returned from that summer, my nervous system was shot. I was really depleted and had PTSD. And I had a very generous, gracious therapist who said, what if I were to teach you to meditate? Which was an unlikely response that he had. And I was like, I'm a mess. And he was like, this could help. Not in a short term. This is not like an acute pill that's going to help, but it's like in a sustained way, this would be one of the tools that could help you. And it has. And so the time I've spent on the cushion has taught me to be with discomfort, both physical and emotional. And it's taught me to know things clearly in a way that's sort of indestructible. Rabbi B'nai Lappi and I talk about that as the quality of svara, that one way that we might translate svara actually is a kind of insight that arises from within us, that we know in such a way that it can't be taken from us. And I think we can call that revelation. I think we can call that insight. And so for me, that journey, it's inseparable from my experience as a trans person to say that we know who we are in this world, which is constantly trying to sort of advertise and tell every single person who they should be. For any person in any identity spectrum to be able to say, I know in my core who I am and it can't be taken from me, and I'm going to live into that in this world. That is a spiritual journey. It's an act of courage, and it requires dedicated practice and attention to manifest.
So I love hearing you talk about Kol Tzedek, and I know that one piece of your congregation's work that you've all been thinking about really deeply is Shemitah, the sabbatical year that's coming up. Listeners to the show know that I'm big into the number 7, and Shemitah, the 7th year in the 7-year cycle, is very much one of my fave sevens in Jewish tradition. So I want to go in that direction for a second. But we as a podcast are about to be going into this unit of episodes about Shemitah from a whole bunch of angles. Shemitah being the sabbatical year that arises every 7 years, that involves various biblical ideas of land resting and other ideas of how we relate to one another as human beings. And what we've been asking for the last few years, really, is whether that particular 7 is a moment for Jews really writ large and across not just questions of the earth, although that's a really big part, especially as we live in a world of climate change and the catastrophes that accompany it. We've been asking, is that a chance to just reset and ask, what Judaism even is right now, what our roles are as individuals, as communities, as a collective of Jews, as the world beyond just Jews. And I have a sense that, especially given that you and your community have thought about this, that you have a lot to contribute to that question. And so really, I'm curious, how has your community started to engage with the sabbatical year? There's tried and true teachings of it from the Torah about how we might relate to land. But I also think that there's particular calls of our time that we could use this upcoming year to dive into. And I'm curious how you engage with that.
For the upcoming high holiday cycle, we always pick a theme. We invite 5 to 10 members of the community to share personal reflections on that theme from their own lives. And so the theme that we've chosen for this upcoming high holidays is Shemitah. And we're translating Shemitah as release and regenerate. Some of the letting go that is part of Shemitah, and some of the growth, some of the kind of wild abandon, letting the land. It's not like letting it go fallow isn't saying let nothing grow from it. It's like letting it be as it is. And I'm really hoping that we can be looking at the many aspects. Shemitah occurs 3 times in Torah, and it has agricultural framework around the land. It has a framework around economic justice and the release from debt. Certainly, I'm hoping that the Biden administration will come through on its word to forgive educational debt. And I can say that there's faith leaders in Philadelphia that are beginning to organize in the way that folks have in Chicago to relieve medical debt also. It also has an element of personal kind of release, like a kind of rest, a kind of renewal that comes from a cessation, a stopping. Certainly that release feels like it has to do with, all prisoners and all slaves going free. And we're looking at it through hopefully an abolition lens of what does it mean to pursue transformation in the criminal justice system and support efforts to further defund the police and reinvest that money in public education here in Philadelphia, as actually a practice of Shemitah, a redistribution of resources, which is part of what it was about. It wasn't just about sort of letting go of debt for its own sake, but about redistributing resources so there would be greater equity for everyone.
I'm interested in hearing more from you about trans theology, which I know is something that you're really passionate about, especially from your perspective as a rabbi of, again, a Reconstructionist, a regular synagogue, right? Because when I think about it as a cis man, the image of God that I grew up with, whether anybody actually believed it or not, but it had this feeling of a old man in the sky. And I never connected to that. And I understood myself, therefore, to be some kind of an atheist. Whereas when I feel like the world, initially it's feminism. Initially, it's the divine feminine. It's a notion of a God that's neither masculine nor feminine, or it's feminine and not masculine, let's say. And I start to feel like, oh, that sounds like a better God to me. And so I guess what I'm trying to unlock here is this question of when we say trans theology, again, it's kind of going back to what I was trying to ask about earlier, that is it possible that once we are led by people who have had a more primary experience of some of the experiences that maybe led to revelation in the first place, that actually we get closer to what it really is for the rest of us?
I think we're lucky to be alive in this Jewish moment. And I think part of what we are living through is a moment of increasingly authentic and embodied Jewish leadership. And some of that is identity-based. Some of that is about a growth of trans and non-binary rabbis. Some of it is about a growth of Jews of color becoming rabbis. And some of it is about also kind of the growth of all sorts of other spiritual movements that are impacting and sort of allowing the role of the rabbi and of Jewish teachers to not sort of be ivory tower, academic, emotionally distant, but actually coming back into intimate connection. There are a lot of, either recovering or practicing atheists at Kol Tzedek, and I think that's for similar reasons as you described, Dan. One of the classes I've probably taught the most is on God. It's sort of, I think, partly because I identify as a religious person. Like I myself am a spiritual religious person, and when I got to Kol Tzedek, I was basically told, like, you're going to want to give a wide berth around the concept of God. And my approach has actually been the opposite, is like, I'm going to want to give a close-up. Like, we're going to need a telephoto lens to really get in at this, because from a wide angle lens, I have no interest. And the first thing I always I say this in every class that I teach and every B'nai Mitzvah student that I work with, which is that God is not a Jewish word. It's a derivative of a German Christian term. In a more observant context, what are you going to find? You're going to find other placeholders, right? If we could all agree God is at least a placeholder for that which is undescribable, something ineffable or mysterious or indefinite, and God is sort of a Christian placeholder that Jews have adopted, we can say, then what were the Jewish placeholders, right? What were the Hebrew placeholders? And we can go to two primary placeholders, the first of which would be Hashem, which you'll find in a more firm or observant context. How are you? Baruch Hashem, blessed is the name, right? The name is the placeholder for the name which is unsayable except by the high priest in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. And the other primary placeholder would be Adonai, my Lord, my master, that which has sort of power and governs me, right? And this is where we get sort of the translation that you'll see in the Jewish Publication Society, where it translates the Lord. It doesn't ever really say the Lord. It actually just has vowel pronunciation placeholders that came out of the Masoretic tradition that told us how to pronounce that which was unsayable. And Rabbi Arthur Green, who was one of my teachers at Hebrew College, really helped me reconnect to the root of what was so unsayable. It was a practice in breath. Yud, He, Vav, He, which are breath sounds. This is the experience of breath. And he reconfigures them, right? The same letters can be reconfigured to be Havaya, to be existence itself. And this brings me back to sort of that insight and meditation-based theology, which is about the unraveling of existence and God being kind of in each of those moments. The other activity that I really cherish is sort of saying, well, if God is not a Jewish name for God, then what is? And one of my chavrutas, one of my learning partners, Rabbi Jordan Bronig, developed a class that I have sort of iterated on a dozen times at least, in which we take 10, 15, 30 different names for the divine as they appear in Tanakh, as they appear in the Hebrew Bible, including their verses, their psukim. So it's not like these are conceptually like, oh, I see God as a midwife. No. The Torah refers to God as a midwife. Not I see God as breath, but the Torah refers to Ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim, like literally a breath, a spirit hovered over the world, over the face of these waters. In moments of tremendous instability, God is tsuri v'goali. God is a rock, right? God is the thing I can lean on. And all of these things are God. And so to the degree that we rely on the placeholders as a kind of spiritual laziness, if I could be so bold to call it that, a kind of spiritual exhaustion would be more generous. I'm not sure what, or maybe actually the people who were transmitting that, they had a greater depth of it and it really was a placeholder for something much more profound and personal. But what I'm finding is at Kol Tzedek and in our generation, we need to go back to the root of the words. And we need to go back to the essence, the ikar, the core of each of these concepts and reinvent them. And one of the projects of that is actually taking core spiritual terms and translating in a way that brings kind of a queer mindfulness sensibility to them. So at Kol Tzedek, instead of sort of saying, let's avoid God altogether, we can remake it, I've sort of said, let's get closer and see if we zoom in, if we get really close, if we can sort of reconnect to, I think, what was its original intentions. And it's the Reconstructionist prayer book, Kol HaNeshama, which at this point is decades old, was brilliant in this because it never translated, what otherwise would have been the unsayable name as Adonai or my Lord or the Lord. It instead, every single time it translates the 4-letter name for the Holy One, the Tetragrammaton, it uses a different name for the divine, the mystery, the infinite, the rock, the compassionate one. And so theologically in prayer, this is extremely transformative to sort of be reminded over and over again that the 70 faces of the divine truly, it's like the at least 70 faces of the divine.
Another important subject for us to get into, because I know that you have done really amazing work on this in multiple ways, is abolition. That's a word that I think a lot of folks are not necessarily used to hearing in a contemporary context. We think about it in the context of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery 150 plus years ago. When you talk about abolition now, help folks understand what you're talking about and help us understand why it is important for us to be thinking about and what kinds of Jewish lenses you're bringing to it through Kol Tzedek.
Prior to starting rabbinical school, the last formative experience I had was that I completed the Ann Braden anti-racist training program. That experience was revelatory for many reasons. And I would say one of the primary reasons was it was my first personal encounter with incarceration, with sort of what we would call, the prison industrial complex, as Angela Davis describes it. And I really left that program with a deep understanding that I felt personally called and personally responsible to respond to the impacts of incarceration in this country as a white person and as a Jew, as part of my anti-racism work. At the end of rabbinical school and after rabbinical school, I worked as a chaplain in 2 different prisons. And I left that work not because I thought I'm done with doing work around mass incarceration or ending the prison system. I left that work because I really see Kol Tzedek and I see all religious communities at very powerful organizing bases. What does it mean to be learning about the roots of the prison industrial complex as an organizing body, as a community on a collective level? What would it mean to become a synagogue where we are sort of become a community for folks who are in reentry coming out of prison, needing community and supports and resources? What does it mean to be part of citywide and statewide and perhaps national efforts to organize to defund the police and reinvest those resources in public schools and affordable housing and access to healthcare? For me, the work of abolition, and I shared about this at my synagogue, is a practice of imagination. It's a practice of taking us from somewhere that we are to somewhere that we could be. All of these political issues really coalesce in their sort of toxic epicenter. And that toxic epicenter is mass incarceration, is prisons, which is a manifestation of it's modern slavery. The work of abolition for me is utterly inseparable and perhaps best characterized in Jewish terms as the work of teshuvah. Teshuvah is a process of transformative repair. We could call it reparations. I've come to see it as actually a theology of impermanence. Teshuvah is the understanding that all things can and will change. And that change makes everything possible. And we know it. The rabbis write about this in Masechet Psachim, in the teachings of the Talmud, when they say, what were the things that were created before the world was created? And the third thing on that list is tshuva. Like tshuva was created right after Torah. And it's because they knew that the world couldn't exist without some sort of mechanism for healing, repair, and transformation. The theology in Torah of abolition is a theology of tshuva, that we as individuals can transform. We as white people can unlearn white supremacy culture. We can become more kind. We can become more compassionate, more empathetic, more sensitized as individuals. And also the world can change. And we will come to see the day in a world without prisons. There was a world long before prisons. The primary occurrences, and perhaps the only occurrences really of prisons as a means of either punishment or deterrent that we see in Jewish thought are in response to foreign empire, right? We can see this in the Torah. We see this in the Joseph story. Joseph is incarcerated in Egypt, right? And we can see this in rabbinic thought too, that incarceration is a mechanism of foreign empire that we are being occupied by and being held accountable by. So what is indigenous to Jewish thought is a theology of tshuva, that change is inherently possible. And for me, that's what abolition is about. It's a belief in our personal and collective capacity to change, and then to say, and we have agency in what that transformation looks like. We are studying tshuva with diligence to say, how do we as individuals need to change? How do we as a community need to change? And how can we be part of collective transformation in that process?
So I'm feeling called to anchor us in place, in geography. Part of where this question is going is that I love deeply that Kol Tzedek, you mentioned one of those name possibilities being Ma'arav, being the West Philly. Like, you're anchored in a place. Like, I think we somehow have this mistaken conception that our synagogues, our Jewish organizations, like, they just sort of happen to be located at whatever place they're located. You know, a Reform synagogue in this city, a Reform synagogue in that city, a conservative synagogue in that city, like, and what makes them what they are is their sort of ideology or their movement or whatever, and not where they are. What we are as communities really ties to where we are in space. So I just as a closing kind of thought, I was curious if you could help us understand Kol Tzedek, your own work in Philadelphia. And look, if it ties to the overarching theme of our unit of trans identity, that's great. If it doesn't, that's also great, because this is, all of this, I believe, is intertwined questions that can help us unlock really important futures for Jews, sure, but for really the world beyond just Jews too.
The story is that Kol Tzedek was founded as a Jewish community for people who didn't historically fit into Jewish communities. Right? It was founded as a synagogue for people who had felt marginalized and excluded from synagogue life. Now, the narrative of who those people are continues to evolve based on sort of the meter of Jewish community, but certainly in its moment, it was queer folks, and it was interfaith and multiracial families. And that's also who lives in, West Philadelphia. That's somewhat the demographics of who lives in this urban area. Now, if we want to talk about place, I think there's a longer conversation to be had, for which I don't even yet feel fully qualified to have, of how we reckon with sort of the Jewish community's locations, right? And what I'm thinking about is that West Philadelphia was home for generations to a vibrant, robust Jewish community. There were yeshivot and schools of study and day schools and synagogues abound. And in the wake of white flight and the practices of redlining, the Jewish community fled to the suburbs of the main line of Philadelphia. And this had a real detrimental effect on this little corner of the neighborhood, as it did in so many major cities. And for the most part, the Jewish community participated in this white flight to the suburbs. The return of Kol Tzedek was the first time that basically there had been an organized synagogue and organized Jewish community in West Philadelphia in decades. but not ever. Like this, there sort of had been this kind of like reaching back a generation. And there's a member of Kol Tzedek who has a picture of her grandfather's bar mitzvah just a few blocks around the corner from where Kol Tzedek gathers. How do we re-arrive, right, re-enter this neighborhood in a way that doesn't then again perpetuate the same harm that the Jewish community's exodus perpetuated, right? How do we not re-arrive and be a force of, or at least solely a force of gentrification and displacement? How do we exist in a way in West Philadelphia that also encourages the wealth and assets of Black communities that have been here for generations and have been here through the process of white flight? And so that's when I think about place, that's really one of our questions. And there's no question, there's a number of reasons why the growth of Kol Tzedek was possible in West Philadelphia in its moment. And one of them was very intentional efforts on the part of the University of Pennsylvania to gentrify and develop a certain area of West Philadelphia referred to as Cedar Park, so that its faculty would want to live in the city. Certainly this has then displaced Black families who were in this neighborhood for generations. And so our presence here is complicated. And that's one of the things as a community that we're wrestling with, that we have to sort of reckon with and be able to sort of be truthful about, so that we can then organize and hopefully work for justice. Hopefully we can be Kol Tzedek in the face of these truths. And these truths are systemic and structural, and they're based on speculative development and all sorts of unjust practices. So that feels important. I also want to say that Kol Tzedek's sense of being outsiders deeply informs our sense of gathering. And one of my favorite things is its sort of spiritual counterpart is a kind of textual insiderness. And so if you came to services at Kol Tzedek, which you're all invited to a Friday night or a Torah study, or come to our virtual Beit Midrash, one of the things you will find is that we actually pray a very traditional matbeya. Our service structure is very traditional. And this is intentional on the part of myself and Rabbi Monica Gomery, because there's a way in which part of where I experience spiritual aliveness is intention, right? I sort of talked about how my queerness was this kind of new, boundary pushing thing. And Judaism was grounding, was old, was ancient. And for me at Kol Tzedek, it's important that we stay in that tension of, we're going to push the political boundaries of what's possible in this moment. We're going to push toward transformation, and we're going to ground deeply in these very ancient practices and these very ancient words. And so our services have this songful, participatory, joyful, and relatively traditional feel to them. And what's kind of amazing is to arrive and say, this is what a Jewish community looks like. This is what Kabbalat Shabbat looks like. And the sort of faces in the screens on Zoom may not be who you're used to seeing, but this is what the emerging Jewish community looks like. And we're really trying to say, in order to have a sense of spiritual groundedness, we need to have kind of a rootedness in liturgy and song and practice. And so one of the things I love about Kol Tzedek is that particular tension.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
You are so welcome. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
And thank you so much for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We want to close out this episode in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook or our Twitter or Instagram pages. Those are all just at Judaism Unbound on those different apps. You can head to our website, JudaismUnbound.com, and you can email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. We would also, of course, deeply appreciate, as Dan mentioned at the top, if you're able to support us, even with $1. Any amount is incredibly helpful. If you are able to support us at JudaismUnbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift, that is greatly appreciated, especially this time of year as we close our fiscal year. And the last thing is that support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Ashman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Ashman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.